The engines catch before dawn. In the darkness over Foggia, the ground crews hear them first. The staggered cough and roar of Pratt & Whitney radials turning over, one after another, across the dispersal pans of southern Italy. It is August 20th, 1944. The sun has not yet broken the Adriatic horizon, but already the B-24 Liberators of the 15th Air Force are taxiing toward their runways, heavy with fuel and 500-pound general-purpose bombs, their aluminum skins slick with dew that will burn off somewhere over Yugoslavia. The target today is an industrial complex in Upper Silesia. The mission folders name it precisely, the IG Farben-Bühne synthetic rubber plant at Monowitz. It is a high-priority installation under the Allied oil plan, the systematic campaign to strangle the German war machine by destroying every refinery, every hydrogenation plant, every synthetic fuel facility that keeps the Wehrmacht's tanks and the Luftwaffe's fighters in operation. Monowitz produces synthetic rubber and methanol. It feeds the Reich's dwindling capacity to wage mechanized war. And so the bombers climb northeast, assembling into formation over the heel of Italy, crossing the Adriatic's flat blue expanse, threading through the mountain passes of the Balkans, and pressing deeper into the industrial heartland of occupied Europe. The crews know the route. They know the flat corridors, the likely fighter interception zones, the rally points for the return leg. What most of them do not know, what does not appear in the mission briefing, what no intelligence officer mentions at the pre-dawn assembly, is what sits fewer than 5 miles west of their bomb release coordinates. 5 miles. In a B-24 cruising at 200 miles per hour, that distance passes beneath the aircraft in 90 seconds. Less than the time it takes a bombardier to toggle his release switches, watch the bombs fall away, and feel the aircraft lift as it sheds its payload. 90 seconds of sky, and beneath it, 2 worlds separated by a purpose so different that the distance between them becomes the central moral fact of 1944. To the east, the Monowitz plant, acres of pipe and steel, cooling towers, reaction vessels, the infrastructure of an industrial economy desperate for raw materials. Slave labourers from the adjacent concentration camp work its production lines. Emaciated men in striped uniforms hauling chemicals under the watch of SS guards and IG Farben foremen. The bombs that fall today will crater its facilities, twist its piping, kill some of its slave workers along with its German supervisors. The plant will be rebuilt. The bombers will return. To the west, 5 miles along a flat Polish plain, Birkenau, 4 crematoria, gas chambers clad in concrete, disguised with sod roofs and the lie of shower rooms. A rail spur that runs directly through the camp's gate and terminates at a selection platform where, on this very day, human beings are sorted into those who will work and those who will die within the hour. The chimneys are burning. The pits are burning. The killing machinery of the final solution is running at a pace it has never reached before and will never reach again. The American bombers pass over. Their cameras photograph the target area. In later decades, analysts will examine these aerial reconnaissance photographs and identify, with perfect clarity, the gas chambers, the crematoria, the rail lines, the columns of human beings moving between the selection ramp and the undressing rooms. All of it visible from the altitude at which the 15th Air Force operates. All of it within the radius of a single course correction. The bombs fall on Monowitz. The crematoria of Birkenau go untouched. The crews turn south. They cross back over the mountains, back over the Adriatic, and land at Foggia in the long Italian afternoon. They file their after-action reports. Bomb damage assessment will follow. The mission is logged as a success. And somewhere in Washington, in the filing cabinets of the War Department, a series of memoranda already carry the answer to the question that this mission makes inescapable. The question is not whether the Americans could reach Auschwitz. August 20th, 1944, proves that they can. The question is why they were never ordered to strike it, and the answer is already written, already signed, already filed. It lives in the careful language of Assistant Secretary of War John J. McCloy, who weeks earlier rejected formal requests to bomb the gas chambers and rail lines with a phrase that will follow him for the rest of his life. The operation would be impracticable and would constitute a diversion of considerable air support essential to the success of our forces now engaged in decisive operations. Impracticable. The word hangs in the air over Foggia as the engines cool. Impracticable. For an air force that has just struck a target 5 miles from the thing it was asked to destroy. This is the story of how that word came to be written, of the request that prompted it, the men who evaluated them, and the machinery of decision that produced an American refusal to bomb Auschwitz in the summer of 1944. It is not a story of ignorance. By the time the critical memoranda were drafted, the Americans possessed detailed intelligence about the camp's location, layout, and function. It is not a simple story of impossibility. The 15th Air Force demonstrated the operational reach on August 20th and in subsequent raids. It is a story of priorities, of what the American command structure valued, what it feared, what it believed the war required, and of the moral arithmetic that allowed men of genuine seriousness to conclude that the greatest genocide in human history was, for purposes of military planning, someone else's problem. The answers do not live in a single villain's office. They live in cable rooms and planning tents, in the overlapping jurisdictions of agencies created for different purposes, in the weight given to one set of lives over another, and in the particular way that bureaucracies say no, not with cruelty, but with procedure. To understand those answers, it is necessary to go back. Back before August 20th, back before the bombers, back to the spring of 1944, when the killing at Birkenau reached a scale that finally forced the question onto desks in Washington, and when 2 men crawled out of the camp itself to ensure that no one could claim they did not know. 3 months before the bombers pass over Monowitz, the machinery they will fail to strike is operating at its absolute ceiling. May 1944. The snow has melted from the flat terrain of Upper Silesia, and the rail lines running into the Auschwitz complex carry a volume of human traffic that dwarfs anything the camp has processed before. The trains come from Hungary. Birkenau by this month has become what its architects always intended: a factory for death operating at industrial throughput. 4 large-scale crematoria stand in the southwestern section of the camp, designated Crematoria 2, 3, 4 and V, each one a self-contained killing installation combining undressing rooms, gas chambers, and banks of incineration furnaces under a single operational sequence. They are purpose-built. Their ventilation systems are engineered to extract Zyklon B residue from the chambers after each gassing. Their furnace capacities are calculated by German engineers with the precision of men designing any other industrial plant. The SS has documented a combined cremation capacity of 4,416 corpses per day across the 4 installations. This is the number they have put on paper. It is not the number they achieved during the Hungarian transports, because the pace of killing exceeds even this engineered capacity, and the overflow is handled in open-air burning pits dug beside the crematoria, where bodies are incinerated on iron grates over wood fires, the smoke rising in columns visible for miles. The 3-track rail spur tells the story of administrative refinement. In earlier phases of the camp's operation, transports arrived at a rail platform outside Birkenau's perimeter, and deportees were marched or trucked to the camp's gate. By May 1944, the spur runs directly into the compound, terminating at a long concrete platform positioned between the crematoria complexes, so that the distance between arrival and death is measured in hundreds of meters rather than kilometers. The trains pull in, the doors open. The selection happens on the platform itself. SS physicians, most notoriously Josef Mengele, pointing left or right with a flick of the hand. Those sent left walk directly toward the undressing rooms of crematoria 2 and 3. The entire sequence from train door to gas chamber can be completed in under 2 hours. On the heaviest days, it is accomplished faster than that. Between May 15th and July 9th, 1944, Hungarian gendarmerie and German SS units deport approximately 437,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz-Birkenau. The transports arrive at a rate of 3 to 4 trains per day, each carrying several thousand people in sealed freight cars. The vast majority, historians estimate 75 to 80%, are gassed upon arrival without ever being registered as camp inmates. They have no numbers tattooed on their arms. They appear in no prisoner roll. They exist only in the transport manifests and in the memory of those who witnessed the selections. The daily killing rate during peak weeks reaches 10,000 people, 10,000 human beings per day, processed through an infrastructure of concrete and steel and Zyklon B that runs with the relentless rhythm of a production line. The scale is so extreme that it strains the crematoria beyond their specifications. Furnace grates warp and crack under continuous use. Chimneys develop fissures from the heat. The Sonderkommando, the prisoners forced to operate the gas chambers and furnaces. work in shifts around the clock, dragging bodies from the chambers, extracting gold teeth, shearing hair, feeding the furnaces. When the furnaces cannot keep pace, the pits burn day and night. The fat rendered from the bodies is collected in channels at the base of the pits and poured back over the flames to accelerate combustion. The smoke is visible from the city of Auschwitz. The smell reaches surrounding villages. The local population knows. The guards know. The overflying reconnaissance aircraft, had anyone examined their photographs closely enough, could have seen the smoke. This is what Birkenau has become by the summer of 1944. Not a camp in any sense that the word implies human habitation, but a killing installation operating at the outermost limit of its physical capacity, consuming the Jewish population of an entire nation in a span of 8 weeks. And the question is already forming. In Jewish communities across Europe, in the underground networks of Slovakia and Hungary, in the Jewish agency offices in Jerusalem and Istanbul, in the cables reaching the War Refugee Board's representatives in Switzerland, the question presses itself forward with the urgency of what is known. The camps can be seen from the air. The rail lines can be mapped. The Allies have the aircraft, the range, the bomb tonnage. Could they bomb this place? Could they destroy the rail lines that feed it, the gas chambers that kill, the crematoria that erase the evidence? And if they could, will they? The answer to that question, in the summer of 1944, depends on what Washington knows. And what Washington knows depends in part on 2 men who in April 1944 decide that no Allied official will ever again be able to claim ignorance of what is happening inside those wire fences. The woodpile is their coffin for 80 hours. Rudolf Weber and Alfred Wetzler press themselves into the hollowed-out space within a stack of lumber, near the camp's outer perimeter on April 7, 1944. The space has been prepared by the camp underground, boards carefully rearranged to create a cavity large enough for 2 men lying flat, with the exterior face of the pile left undisturbed so that a casual inspection reveals nothing. The critical addition is gasoline-soaked tobacco, packed into the cavity's crevices and scattered around the pile's perimeter. When the SS discovers 2 prisoners missing at the evening roll call, they will deploy tracking dogs. The pungent combination of gasoline and tobacco is designed to overwhelm the dog's ability to isolate human scent. Weber is 20 years old. He has been in Auschwitz since June 1942. He has served as a registrar in the camp's quarantine section, a position that gave him access to transport records, the arrival dates, the numbers, the national origins of the murdered. He carries this data in his memory, meticulous, organised, ready to be dictated. Wetzler, 26, has been in the camp since April 1942, working in the mortuary section and later the registration office. Together they possess an overlapping, corroborating knowledge of the camp's operations, its geography, its killing sequences, its administrative rhythms, that no single witness has previously carried to the outside world. The 80 hours in the woodpile are a test of nerve beyond ordinary endurance. They hear the sirens, they hear the guards shouting, the dogs barking. The SS standard procedure after an escape is a 3-day expanded search perimeter, guards posted at every road, every crossing, every farm within a wide radius. Only after 72 hours does the search contract back to the camp's immediate area. The 2 men wait for the perimeter to relax. They wait in darkness, in the smell of wood and tobacco and their own bodies, not daring to shift position for fear of disturbing the lumber's face. On the night of April 10th they emerge. They move south, travelling at night, navigating by the stars and by a page torn from a child's atlas. A map so crude that it shows only major rivers and towns. They carry a knife and a few scraps of food. For 15 days they walk, avoiding roads, sleeping in forests, crossing the border from occupied Poland into Slovakia. They cover roughly 80 miles of terrain that is under German control, threaded with patrols, raked by the suspicion of a security apparatus that has learned to expect escape attempts. They make it. By late April, they reach contacts in the Slovak Jewish underground who bring them to Žilina. In Žilina, the debriefing begins. Weber and Wetzler sit in a safe house and dictate everything. Oskar Krasniansky of the Slovak Jewish Council transcribes and translates. The result is 33 pages, typed, precise, organised with a clinical detachment that is itself a strategic choice. Weber has been advised by the underground to err on the side of facts, to suppress emotion, to present the information in a form that sceptical Western officials cannot dismiss as hysteria or exaggeration. The report describes the camp's physical layout in geographic detail sufficient to construct a map. It names the crematoria, their positions, their capacities. It describes the selection process on the rail platform. It estimates the number of people killed by national origin, the transports from France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Greece, Slovakia, the Czech lands. It describes the inauguration of a crematorium in March 1943, when prominent guests from Berlin attended, and the program consisted of the gassing and burning of 8,000 Jews from Krakow, and the visitors were, in the report's words, extremely satisfied with the results. It notes, with devastating specificity, that a special peephole had been fitted into the door of the gas chamber, and that the guests made constant use of it. The report is not a cry for help written in anguish. It is an intelligence document. It reads like the product of reconnaissance, because that is what 2 years of forced proximity to mass murder had made it. Werber and Wetzler had observed the killing from inside the machinery itself, and they deliver their observations in the language of a staff officer's briefing, precisely so that the men who receive it will have no grounds to set it aside. From Jelena, the report moves. It moves through the channels of a wartime underground that operates with painfully inadequate speed against the urgency of what it carries. The Slovak Jewish Council shares it with the Jewish Agency's representative in Budapest. It reaches the papal nuncio in Slovakia, who transmits a summary to the Vatican. It reaches Swiss contacts, and from Switzerland the information begins to surface. By mid-June 1944, details from the Werber-Wetzler report are appearing in the Swiss press. The substance of what Auschwitz-Birkenau is, not a labour camp, not a detention facility, but a purpose-built extermination installation processing hundreds of thousands of people, is becoming known to anyone in the Allied intelligence apparatus who cares to look. The critical transmission line for American decision-making runs through Bern. Roswell McClelland, the War Refugee Board's representative in Switzerland, receives the report's contents and cables the essential information to Washington. By late June, the War Refugee Board possesses, in its files, in its cables, in the knowledge of its staff, a description of Auschwitz-Birkenau that is detailed enough to identify targets on an aerial photograph. The layout of the crematoria, their position relative to the rail spur, the path that deportees walk from train to gas chamber, the location of the undressing rooms, the capacity of the furnaces. The full English translation of the complete report will not be formally published by the War Refugee Board until November 1944, a delay that itself constitutes a small bureaucratic scandal. But the information is not waiting for the printed version. It circulates within intelligence channels. It informs the requests that will be made. It underpins the specific nature of the proposals that reach the War Department's desk. Not vague pleas to do something, but precise operational suggestions to bomb identifiable structures at known coordinates. This is the ground that has been laid by the time the bombing question arrives in Washington. 2 men walked out of Auschwitz carrying the evidence in their memories. They dictated it with the care of men who understood that credibility was their only weapon. Their report travelled through an agonizingly slow chain of transmission, weeks lost to translation, to the cautiousness of intermediaries, to the sheer difficulty of moving sensitive documents through wartime Europe. But it arrived. By the summer of 1944, the American government possesses a description of the Auschwitz killing operation that is detailed, specific, and credible. No one in Washington who participates in the bombing debate can claim they do not know what they are being asked to strike. The Werber-Wetzler report has removed that defense. What remains is a different kind of question, not what's happening, but what are we willing to do about it? And the answer to that question will be written not in the safe houses of Slovakia or the cable rooms of Bern, but in the offices of the War Department in Washington, by men whose war has different priorities, different maps, and a different calculus of what constitutes an acceptable use of American air power. The report sits in the files. The trains continue to roll into Birkenau, and in Washington, a small agency created only months earlier, understaffed, underfunded, operating at the margin of a government consumed by the logistics of invasion, begins the process of translating what it knows into a formal request. The War Refugee Board has the information, now it needs to find someone with the authority to act on it, and the will to say yes. The agency that will carry this request forward exists in January 1944, only as a signature on a piece of paper. It is born not from moral awakening, but from institutional embarrassment, from the moment when one cabinet secretary's staff forces another cabinet secretary's complicity into the light. The date is January 22nd, 1944. Franklin Roosevelt sits in the Oval Office and signs Executive Order 947, establishing the War Refugee Board. The document's language is careful, bureaucratic, appropriately presidential. The board shall provide immediate rescue and relief to victims of Nazi persecution. It sounds, on paper, like the full weight of the American government pivoting toward salvation. The reality behind the signature is something rawer, more compromised, and far more instructive about the kind of government that will eventually refuse to bomb Auschwitz. The pressure that produces this executive order comes from one man's fury and another man's shame. Henry Morgenthau Jr., Secretary of the Treasury, Roosevelt's neighbour from Dutchess County, one of the few Jews in the president's inner circle, has spent the winter of 1943 watching his own staff uncover something ugly. His lawyers, young, sharp, morally outraged Treasury men, have been tracing the path of rescue proposals through the State Department and finding at every turn obstruction, cables suppressed, visa applications blocked, rescue plans delayed into irrelevance. The information about the killing of European Jews has been reaching Washington for more than a year, and the State Department has been, with quiet bureaucratic efficiency, ensuring that this information produces no action. Morgenthau's staff distills their findings into 18 pages. They title the document with the precision of prosecutors. Report to the Secretary on the acquiescence of this government in the murder of the Jews. The word acquiescence is chosen carefully. Not failure, not inability. Acquiescence. The knowing acceptance of something one has the power to oppose. The report names names. It identifies specific cables that were suppressed. It documents the pattern by which Breckinridge Long and his subordinates at the State Department ensured that information about the Holocaust did not become the basis for rescue operations. Morgenthau takes this document to the President. He does not deliver it in its original form. The title is softened for Roosevelt's desk to something less accusatory. But the substance is unchanged. The message is clear. Your State Department has been actively obstructing the rescue of Jews, and the paper trail is now in the hands of men who will not stay silent. Whether Roosevelt acts from conscience or from political calculation, midterm elections approach, the Jewish vote matters, a scandal would be damaging. The result is the same. He signs the order. The War Refugee Board exists, and into the directorship of this new creation steps John Paley. He is 34 years old, a Treasury lawyer, not a diplomat, not a military man, not a figure of any particular public stature. He has spent the war years in the Treasury Department's Foreign Funds Control Division, tracking Axis assets, enforcing financial sanctions, detailed technical work that has given him an understanding of how money and power move through wartime bureaucracy. He knows how cables get sent and how they get lost. He knows which offices can expedite and which offices bury. He is, in the language of Washington, an operator, a man who understands that in a government at war, the difference between a policy and a dead letter is entirely a matter of who pushes the paper and how hard they push it. Paley inherits, with his new title, a structural paradox that will define every action the War Refugee Board takes for the remainder of the war. The executive order gives the board a mandate that sounds expansive, immediate rescue and relief, but the order gives the board almost nothing with which to execute that mandate, no operational budget. The funds that keep the WRB running come overwhelmingly from private Jewish organizations. The American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the World Jewish Congress, channeling money through a government agency that serves, in some respects, as a legitimizing conduit for efforts that private citizens have been attempting on their own for years. Over 90% of the board's funding originates outside the federal treasury. More critically, the executive order gives the board no authority over the institutions that would need to act if rescue is to mean anything beyond cable traffic and diplomatic notes. The War Department answers to Stimson, the State Department answers to Hull, the military answers to Marshall, to Eisenhower, to the Joint Chiefs. The War Refugee Board can recommend, it can request, it can argue, cajole, and leverage Morgenthau's proximity to the President. But it cannot order a single bomber into the air, reassign a single diplomat, or redirect a single military transport. It operates entirely through persuasion and borrowed power. This is the architecture of American rescue policy in 1944. A presidential mandate wrapped around an institutional vacuum. Paley understands this from his first day. He will later describe the board's work with the devastating concision of a man who has measured what was possible against what was needed and found the gap unbridgeable. Little and late. By January 1944, more than 5 million Jews are already dead. The killing apparatus is not winding down. It is accelerating, preparing for the final destruction of Hungarian Jewry. The War Refugee Board arrives at its task the way a fire brigade arrives at a structure already consumed, with only the question remaining of how many can be pulled from the upper floors before the whole thing collapses. Paley sets up operations at 1734 New York Avenue in Washington. The office is small, the staff is small, the leverage is borrowed. But the cables begin to come in, and the cables demand answers. The transmission lines run through Bern, through Lisbon, through Stockholm, through every neutral capital where the WRB has managed to station a representative or recruit a willing contact. And in the spring and summer of 1944, one transmission line dominates all others, the line from Switzerland, where Roswell McClellan sits at the intersection of intelligence about the Hungarian deportations and the agonized pleas of Jewish organizations who can see what is coming and cannot stop it. June 1944. The cables arrive at 1734 New York Avenue with a frequency and an urgency that transforms the office's daily rhythm. What McClellan sends from Bern is not rumour, not second-hand report, not the vague atrocity stories that have circulated since 1942. It is the substance of the Auschwitz protocols, the Werber-Wetzler report with its precise physical descriptions of the killing installation, filtered through McClellan's covering notes and transmitted with the explicitness of a man who understands that ambiguity is the bureaucrat's escape route. The Jewish agency's leadership undergoes its own transformation during these weeks. Initial caution, the institutional reluctance to make demands one cannot enforce, gives way as the intelligence hardens. Richard Lichtheim, the agency's representative in Geneva, sends summaries that leave no room for the comfortable interpretation that Auschwitz might be something other than what it is. Moshe Chertok, who will press the British Foreign Office for action, reverses whatever hesitation preceded certainty. The identification of Auschwitz-Birkenau as a death factory is no longer contested among those with access to the reports. What is contested is what to do about it. The requests that converge on Washington in late June and July 1944 are not abstract. They name targets, they describe routes, they identify the specific rail corridor, the Košice-Prešov line running north through Slovakia into occupied Poland, as the artery carrying 12,000 Hungarian Jews per day toward the gas chambers. The specificity is deliberate. Those crafting the requests understand that vagueness allows rejection on technical grounds. They provide what an operations officer would need: a defined target set, a rationale for urgency, a scale of human consequence. On June 24, 1944, Paley carries this material into a meeting with Assistant Secretary of War John J. McCloy. The meeting is not a surprise. Paley has been building toward this conversation through weeks of cable traffic and internal preparation. He presents the requests as they have reached him. Bomb the gas chambers and crematoria at Birkenau. Bomb the rail lines carrying the deportation transports. He frames the case as the cables frame it, in terms of lives that can be saved by disrupting the killing mechanism, even temporarily. McCloy's response comes on July 4, 1944. It is a refusal. The operation is labelled impracticable. The reasoning, such as it is, invokes the diversion of air resources from decisive military operations. The memo does not engage with the specific operational questions, range, bomb loads, available squadrons, mission routing, that would constitute a genuine feasibility assessment. No air commander in the Mediterranean theatre is consulted. No request for operational analysis reaches 15th Air Force headquarters in Italy. The refusal originates and terminates within the War Department's civilian offices in Washington. But the refusal does not end the conversation. It cannot. The cables continue to arrive. The deportations continue. The gap between what America knows and what America does widens with every transport that arrives at the Birkenau rail spur. And inside the War Refugee Board's office, a staff attorney named Benjamin Aksin begins to write. Aksin is Latvian-born, a legal scholar, a Zionist, a man whose personal connection to the destruction of European Jewry is not abstract. He works in the WRB's cramped quarters, with full access to the cable traffic from Bern, full knowledge of the Auschwitz protocols, and a lawyer's instinct for the argument that cuts through procedural evasion. In June 1944, he produces an internal memorandum that will become one of the most cited documents in the historiography of the bombing debate, not because it changed the outcome, but because it articulated with painful clarity the moral logic that the War Department's refusal refused to engage. Akzin's argument strips away the comfortable distance between the decision-makers in Washington and the people arriving at Birkenau's rail platform. He confronts the obvious objection head-on. Bombing the gas chambers and crematoria would risk killing Jewish prisoners. Allied bombs falling on Birkenau would not distinguish between the SS guards, the camp infrastructure, and the inmates held within the wire. This is not a hypothetical concern. It is the first objection that any humane person raises when confronted with the proposal to bomb a concentration camp. Akzin's response to this objection is the document's moral core. The prisoners in Birkenau, he argues, are doomed. They are not awaiting liberation. They are not being held for ransom or exchange. They are being processed through an industrial killing system that will murder them, all of them, systematically, on a timetable the Nazis have already demonstrated they can maintain. Death by Allied bombs, Akzin writes, is not being weighed against survival. It is being weighed against death in the gas chambers. And if the destruction of the crematoria halts, or even slows the killing mechanism, if it forces the Germans to find alternative methods, rebuild facilities, reroute transports, then future victims may live who would otherwise die. The arithmetic is brutal, but Akzin insists it be confronted rather than evaded. This is not an argument made lightly. It requires accepting that Allied action will kill some of the people it aims to save. It requires the moral calculus of triage, the same calculus that every battlefield commander makes when ordering an assault that will cost friendly lives, the same calculus that sends bomber crews over defended targets knowing that some will not return. Akzin's memo insists that the War Department apply to Jewish lives the same reasoning it applies routinely to military lives, that some must be risked so that others may be preserved. The memo circulates within the WRB. It becomes part of the internal record. It strengthens the hand of those who want Peely to push harder, to return to McCloy with greater force. But it does not exist in a vacuum of unanimity. From outside the board, from within the very organizations most directly engaged in the rescue effort, comes a dissenting voice, and it belongs to a man whose credentials in the fight to save European Jews cannot be questioned. Leon Kubowitzki heads the rescue department of the World Jewish Congress. His organization has been at the forefront of efforts to publicize the Holocaust, to pressure Allied governments, to find any lever that might slow the killing. He is not a bystander. He is not an obstructionist. And on July 1st, 1944, he writes to Peyle opposing the bombing of Birkenau. Kubowitzki's objection runs along a different axis than the War Department's. He does not invoke military necessity or the diversion of air assets. He invokes the lives of the prisoners. Bombing the camp would kill inmates. Jews who are still alive, who might still be liberated if the war ends soon enough, who might still be saved through negotiation or rescue. He fears, too, the propaganda value the Germans would extract. Allied bombs killing Jews, Allied aircraft attacking a camp full of civilian prisoners. The Nazis, Kubowitzki argues, would use such an event to muddy the moral clarity of the Allied cause, to claim equivalence between their own crimes and Allied destruction. The tension between Akzin's position and Kubowitzki's is not resolvable by logic alone. Both men are right about something. Akzin is right that the prisoners face certain death in the gas chambers, and that destroying the killing infrastructure might save future arrivals. Kubowitzki is right that bombing will kill people who are, in this moment, still alive, and that once those bombs fall, no power on earth can undo the killing they accomplish. The disagreement is not between rescue advocates and indifferent bureaucrats. It is between two men who want the same thing, and cannot agree on whether this particular instrument will achieve it. What makes this internal debate historically significant is not its resolution. Neither Akzin's memo nor Kubowitzki's letter changes the War Department's position, but what it reveals about the nature of the bombing question itself. This is not a case where moral clarity pointed unambiguously in one direction, and cowardice or indifference block the path. The people closest to the crisis, the people with the deepest personal stake in the outcome, disagree among themselves about whether bombing is the right answer. Kubowitzki himself embodies the complexity. Even as he opposes bombing the camp, he forwards to the WRB requests from others, from Ernest Fischer of the Czechoslovak State Council, from other Jewish leaders, who urge precisely what he himself has rejected. He transmits their pleas faithfully even as he registers his dissent. The Jewish leadership's position in the summer of 1944 is not monolithic. It shifts as the deportations intensify, as the scale of Hungarian Jewry's destruction becomes undeniable, as hope for diplomatic intervention fades. Some who hesitated in June will press for bombing in August. Some who advocated bombing will later question whether it could have worked. The consensus that historians sometimes impose retrospectively, that bombing was obviously the right course and only American indifference prevented it, does not exist in real time. What exists is anguish, disagreement, and the terrible awareness that every day of debate is a day of killing. But this internal complexity within the Jewish rescue community does not absolve the War Department of its own failures of engagement. Aksin and Kubowitzki are arguing about whether bombing would work and whether it is morally justified. The War Department never reaches this argument. McCloy's refusal does not weigh Aksin's logic against Kubowitzki's. It does not consult the operational record to determine whether precision bombing of the crematoria is feasible. It does not ask the 15th Air Force whether a mission to Birkenau can be mounted. It simply declares the operation impracticable and moves on, leaving the moral argument unjoined, the operational question unasked, and the cable traffic from Bern accumulating in the files at 1734 New York Avenue like a weight that no filing cabinet can contain. Paley reads the refusal. He reads Aksin's memo. He reads Kubowitzki's letter. He reads the cables still arriving from McClelland, still reporting the movement of transports, still describing the acceleration of killing. The board's director is not a man given to dramatic gestures. He is a Treasury lawyer, methodical, institutional in his instincts. But he is also a man who understands that a first refusal is not necessarily a final answer. The War Department has said no. The War Refugee Board has not yet decided to accept that answer, and so Paley writes. He writes not as a man making a humanitarian plea, though the documents on his desk would justify any tone of desperation, but as a government official addressing a peer in the language their shared institutions recognize. The letter that takes shape in his office at 1734 New York Avenue in the final days of June and into July 1944 is a small masterpiece of bureaucratic calibration. Every sentence is weighted. Every clause is measured against the question of how it will land on the desk of John J. McCloy, a man whose professional life is governed by the grammar of military necessity. Paley frames the request around rail infrastructure. The Košice-Prešov line. The junction points where rolling stock funnels southward from the collection centres of Hungary toward the Polish border and then northward into Upper Silesia. He describes geometry, rail geometry, as though the transports carry material rather than human beings. He attaches documentation, excerpts from the Werber-Wetzler report, the specifics that McClellan transmitted from Bern, the maps that show where the lines converge before reaching the camp complex. The precision of his language is deliberate. He is not asking the War Department to save Jews. He is asking the War Department to evaluate a targeting proposal against enemy transportation infrastructure in a combat theatre where American bombers are already operating. The distinction matters. Paley understands, has understood since January, since the board's founding, that the War Department operates inside a doctrinal enclosure. Military resources serve military objectives. The defeat of Germany is the objective. Everything that does not serve that objective is by definition a diversion. If the bombing request arrives framed as rescue, it dies on contact with this logic. If it arrives framed as interdiction of enemy rail capacity supporting industrial and military operations in Upper Silesia, it at least possesses the structural form that might survive first contact with a military bureaucracy. This is not cynicism on Paley's part, it is literacy. He has spent months learning the language the War Department speaks, and he chooses to speak it now because the alternative, moral appeal, humanitarian urgency, the raw testimony of escapees describing the interior of gas chambers, has no purchase in the institutional culture he is addressing. The men at the War Department are not indifferent to suffering in the way that word is commonly understood. They are indifferent in a more systemic sense. Their professional apparatus has no receptor for suffering as an input to targeting decisions. Paley's letter attempts to create a receptor by encoding the request in terms the system can process. He attaches the maps. The Košice-Prešov rail corridor is specific, identifiable, targetable. The distances are known. The 15th Air Force flying from Foggia has already demonstrated the range to reach Upper Silesia. The E.G. Farben complex at Monowitz sits on target lists that have been validated by operational planning staffs. Paley does not need to argue that bombers can reach the area. He needs only to argue that this particular set of rail targets merits inclusion in an already active campaign. And yet, even as he writes with such care, Paley harbours private doubts. He has read Kubowitzki's objections. He has weighed the terrible arithmetic. Bombs falling on rail lines can be repaired in days, perhaps hours, by forced labour the Germans possess in abundance. Bombs falling on the camp itself might kill prisoners. The uncertainty gnaws at him. But the cables from McClelland keep arriving. The transports keep moving. 12,000 human beings a day. That figure transmitted from Bern sits in the files like an accusation directed at everyone who reads it and does nothing. Paley's doubts do not paralyse him. They make him careful. They make him frame the request in a way that invites the War Department to do what he cannot do from his office on New York Avenue. Conduct an actual operational assessment. Tell him whether it is feasible. Tell him whether it would work. Tell him whether the targeting geometry permits a strike that would meaningfully disrupt the killing process. This is what Paley asks for. Not a commitment to bomb, an assessment, an exploration. He wants the War Department to appropriately explore the proposal, to run it through the machinery of operational planning, to let the air staffs examine it, to produce the kind of analysis that would allow an informed decision rather than a reflexive refusal. The letter goes to McCloy, and here the structural question emerges, the question that will hang over every subsequent event like a shadow that no amount of archival research has fully dispelled. Does McCloy's office transmit the request to the Army Air Forces? Does it reach the operational planning staffs at 15th Air Force headquarters in Foggia? Does any targeting officer examine the Košice-Prešov rail geometry against the current allocation of sorties? Does any intelligence analyst compare the attached maps against the photographic reconnaissance already in hand? The archival record suggests the answer is no. Or rather, it suggests that whatever process occurred within the War Department bore no resemblance to the thorough operational review that McCloy's eventual refusal language implies. When McCloy later writes that the War Department has taken the best military opinion on its feasibility, he deploys a phrase that functions as bureaucratic armour. It implies consultation, expertise, careful weighing of factors. But the paper trail beneath that phrase is thin to the point of transparency. Requests made through lower channels were frequently rejected without ascending to senior command. The language of McCloy's refusals, impracticable, diversion of considerable air support, appears in earlier unrelated rejections, recycled like boilerplate from a template designed to close files rather than open investigations. Paley's carefully constructed letter, with its maps and its rail geometry and its deferential military framing, enters the War Department and encounters not a decision-making process, but a decision already made. The question is not whether to bomb. The question was settled in February 1944, months before the War Refugee Board began forwarding requests. When the War Department formalised its position, military resources serve military objectives exclusively. Rescue is not a military objective. Therefore, no military resources will be allocated to rescue. The syllogism is complete before Paley's envelope is opened. To understand why the answer takes the form it does, one must understand the man who signs it. John J. McCloy arrives at the War Department in 1941 with the credentials of a man the American establishment trusts instinctively. Wall Street lawyer, partner at Cravath, a man who moves between boardrooms and government offices with the ease of someone who regards both as extensions of the same governing class. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, himself a Wall Street lawyer, a man of the old Republican establishment, 77 years old in 1944 and governing the largest military apparatus in American history, selects McCloy as his utility man. The title is Assistant Secretary of War, but the function is broader. McCloy handles the matters that do not fit neatly into organizational charts. Sensitive questions. Questions that touch the intersection of military operations and political reality. Questions that require a certain kind of judgment. Not operational judgment, which belongs to the generals, but institutional judgment, the ability to know what a decision will look like in 6 months, what precedent it sets, what doors it opens or closes. By the summer of 1944, McCloy has handled Japanese-American internment. He has handled questions of racial integration in the armed forces. He has handled the delicate politics of occupation planning. He is, in the taxonomy of Washington, a fixer, though the word implies a cynicism that does not quite capture his self-understanding. McCloy sees himself as a man of responsibility, a man who makes hard decisions because someone must, a man who understands that the machinery of war cannot stop to accommodate every claim on its attention, however morally compelling. This is not villainy. It is something more difficult to narrate and more dangerous in its consequences. It is the ordinary functioning of a certain kind of institutional mind. McCloy does not refuse the bombing request because he is indifferent to the murder of Jews. He refuses it because his institutional position, his professional formation, and the bureaucratic culture he inhabits have already determined the shape of acceptable answers before the question arrives. The War Department exists to win the war. Winning the war means destroying German military capacity. Destroying German military capacity means allocating every available sortie to targets that degrade the enemy's ability to fight. The gas chambers at Birkenau do not degrade the enemy's ability to fight. Therefore, they are not targets. The logic is seamless, self-reinforcing, and, within its own frame, irrefutable. What it cannot accommodate is the possibility that the frame itself is wrong. That a war fought against a regime whose central project is genocide might require a definition of military necessity capacious enough to include the disruption of that genocide. That the distinction between military objectives and humanitarian objectives might collapse when the enemy's war-making and the enemy's mass murder share the same rail lines, the same industrial infrastructure, the same 5-mile radius of Upper Silesian landscape. McCloy does not entertain this possibility because nothing in his professional formation equips him to entertain it. He is a man of precedent, and there is no precedent for this. He is a man of institutional loyalty, and his institution has already spoken. The culture around him reinforces the closure. George Marshall's army runs on doctrine and delegation. Targeting decisions flow upward through intelligence assessments, through operational planning staffs, through theatre commanders who balance sortie availability against target priority, against weather windows, against aircraft losses. Into this machinery, a request from a small interagency board with no budget and no operational authority, a board that cannot order a single airplane into the air, arrives with all the institutional weight of a memorandum from a distant office whose concerns, however urgent, exist outside the system's field of vision. McCloy does not need to be callous. He needs only to be what he is, a man embedded in a system that has already decided what it will and will not do, addressing a request from outside that system in the only language the system provides. Impracticable. Diversion of considerable air support. The positive solution is the earliest possible victory. The words write themselves. And above McCloy, above Stimson, above the War Department's settled doctrine, there hangs the weight of the oil plan. The strategic commitment that governs every targeting conversation in every command tent and planning room in the European theatre by the summer of 1944. General Karl Spaatz commands the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe. He is an airman of the old school, one of the generation that built the doctrine of strategic bombing from theory into operational reality, that argued through the interwar years that air power could break an enemy's capacity to wage war by striking at the industrial foundations beneath the battlefield. By 1944, that theory has found its ultimate test case in the oil plan, the systematic destruction of Germany's synthetic fuel production. The logic is elegant and, by mid-1944, demonstrably effective. Germany lacks natural petroleum. The Wehrmacht runs on synthetic fuel. Coal-to-liquid plants clustered in the Ruhr, in central Germany, in Silesia. Destroy those plants and the tanks stop rolling, the aircraft stop flying, the U-boats stop sailing. Intelligence assessments flowing through Spaatz's headquarters confirm what the bomber crews report. Fuel production is collapsing. The lunar complex, struck repeatedly, operates at a fraction of capacity. Blechhammer, the synthetic fuel plant in Upper Silesia, within range of the 15th Air Force flying from Foggia, absorbs raid after raid. And Monowitz, the IG Farben-Bühne plant, 5 miles from Birkenau, already on the target calendar, already validated by the intelligence staffs, already part of the war the 15th Air Force is fighting in the summer of 1944. The oil plan does not merely set priorities, it creates a culture of targeting that functions as a closed system. Every sortie allocated to a non-oil target is a sortie subtracted from the campaign that, by every metric available to Spatz's planners, is working. The Pleisch raids, the long costly missions to Romania's oil fields, have already demonstrated that the 15th Air Force will absorb extraordinary losses to strike fuel targets. The commitment is total, the faith is institutional. And inside that faith, any request that does not serve the oil plan faces not merely skepticism, but categorical exclusion. There is no doctrinal space for humanitarian interdiction. There is no planning category for targets whose destruction serves not the degradation of enemy war-making capacity, but the preservation of civilian lives. The system has no intake valve for such requests. This is the structural reality that Paley's carefully worded letter encounters. Not malice, not even indifference in the usual sense. Something more impersonal and more implacable. The operational grammar of a military bureaucracy in the middle of a campaign it believes is winning. The targeting calendars are full. The sorties are allocated. 15th Air Force crews are briefed for Blechhammer, for Pleisch, for Monowitz, for the IG Farben plant that sits 5 miles from the crematoria, where, on the same days those crews fly their missions, the gas chambers process thousands of human beings into ash. The proximity is not theoretical, it is cartographic fact. The reconnaissance photographs that guide the bombers to Monowitz show at the edge of the frame the rectangular outlines of Birkenau's barracks, the squat forms of the crematoria, the rail spur that terminates inside the camp. The airmen do not see these structures as targets. They see them as terrain features adjacent to the real target. The synthetic rubber plant, the fuel infrastructure, the industrial capacity that feeds the German war machine. The distinction is not perverse in the context of their training and their doctrine. They are fighting an air war against an industrial economy. They have been taught, by years of theory, by months of operational experience, by the institutional culture of the Army Air Forces, that the path to victory runs through factories and refineries and rail yards that serve factories and refineries. The crematoria serve no factory. The gas chambers produce no fuel. In the targeting taxonomy of the oil plan, Birkenau does not exist, and so the calendars remain full, the sorties remain allocated. The bombers fly to Monowitz, will fly there on August 20th, will fly there again in September, will fly there again in December, and each time they pass within 5 miles of the killing infrastructure, and each time they turn for home without dropping a single bomb on the rail spur, or the gas chambers, or the crematoria, whose chimneys send columns of smoke into the same sky the liberators cross at 26,000 feet. The operational capability is not in question. The range is proven, the navigation is validated, the bomb loads are sufficient. What is in question, what has never been in question inside the command structure, is whether this particular set of structures constitutes a legitimate target within the doctrinal framework that governs the air war. The answer, formed before anyone asks the question, is no. Auschwitz is not an oil plant, therefore Auschwitz is not a target, therefore the request is impracticable, therefore the file is closed. But files, in a bureaucracy at war, are never truly closed. They accumulate, they wait. And in the offices of the War Refugee Board, in the cable rooms where McClellan's dispatches continue to arrive from Bern, in the desk drawers where Pella keeps his copy of the refusal alongside his copy of the Auschwitz protocols, the weight of unanswered questions grows heavier with each transport that moves along the Koschitzer-Preshov corridor toward the platform at Birkenau, where the selections take place under the eyes of men in white coats who gesture left or right, life or death, with the casual efficiency of traffic policemen directing the morning commute. The summer deepens, the killing continues, and the War Department's answer, impracticable, diversion, earliest possible victory, sits in the files like a door that someone has locked from the inside, convinced that no one on the other side possesses a key worth trying. The key, if one existed, would have to be forged from operational data, from range tables and fuel calculations and sortie records already compiled in the mission folders at Foggia, from the flight paths already drawn on the acetate overlays in the briefing huts of the 15th Air Force. So let the question be asked plainly, in the language the War Department claims to respect. What would it actually take? Begin with geography. Foggia sits in southern Italy, on the flat Apulian plain east of Naples. The airfields there, a constellation of bomber bases built on reclaimed farmland, host the heavy groups of the 15th Air Force, the strategic arm tasked with reaching targets that the 8th, flying from England, cannot efficiently strike. The 15th's area of responsibility stretches north and east. The oil refineries of Plost in Romania, the aircraft factories of Wiener Neustadt in Austria, the marshalling yards of Budapest and, critically, the synthetic fuel plants of Upper Silesia, Blechhammer North, Blechhammer South, Odertal, and Monowitz, where IG Farben's Bühnewerke Abwach produces synthetic rubber and fuel for the Reich. The distance from Foggia to Auschwitz-Birkenau is approximately 620 miles. A B-24 Liberator cruising at around 200 miles per hour altitude covers this distance in roughly 3 hours. The combat radius of the B-24, the maximum distance it can fly, deliver ordnance and return, comfortably exceeds this figure. The B-17 Flying Fortress possesses similar range. Both aircraft types are stationed at Foggia in substantial numbers by the summer of 1944. Both fly regularly to Upper Silesia. The mission logs prove this. July 7th, Blechhammer. July 8th, Blechhammer again. July 22nd, the refineries south of Breslau. The routes pass within miles of the Auschwitz complex. Some pass directly over it. The navigators note the Vistula and the Soa, the confluence of rivers that marks the camp's location. They note the rail junctions. They note the industrial smoke. They do not note the crematoria, but they fly over them week after week in formations of dozens, sometimes hundreds of heavy bombers, each carrying between 4,000 and 8,000 pounds of high explosive. Range is not a problem. Range has never been a problem. The aircraft are already there. What about accuracy? This is the harder question, and it deserves honest examination. Daylight precision bombing in 1944 is not what its name implies. The Norden bomb sight, that instrument of almost mystical reputation, the device so secret that bombardiers are instructed to destroy it rather than let it fall into enemy hands, performs superbly in controlled conditions. In test drops over the Salton Sea, in clear air with no wind shear and no flak, it can place a bomb within a few dozen feet of its target. Over Europe in combat, the numbers are different. The average circular error probable, the radius within which half the bombs from a formation will land, frequently exceeds 1,000 feet. On bad days, with cloud cover or heavy anti-aircraft fire disrupting the formation's bomb run, it exceeds 2,000. Bombs scatter, bombs miss, bombs hit the wrong target, the wrong factory, the wrong rail junction, the wrong block of houses adjacent to the actual aim point. This is the reality of strategic bombing in 1944, and it is a reality that cuts in two directions simultaneously. On one hand, it means that a raid on the gas chambers of Birkenau, structures of finite size separated from prisoner barracks by hundreds of yards, not thousands, carries genuine risk of killing the very people the raid intends to save. This is not a trivial objection. The crematoria sit within a camp that holds tens of thousands of prisoners. Errant bombs, and there will be errant bombs, will fall on barracks, on the women's camp, on the hospital blocks. People will die who might otherwise have survived until liberation. This is the operational truth that A. Leon Kubowitzki raised, and it is not dismissible. On the other hand, and this is where the War Department's logic begins to fracture, the same accuracy limitations apply to every target the 15th Air Force strikes that summer. The Bühnewerke at Monowitz are surrounded by a labour camp. The refineries at Blechhammer sit adjacent to prisoner barracks. The marshalling yards of Budapest border civilian neighbourhoods. In none of these cases does the Army Air Forces decline to bomb on the grounds that collateral casualties render the operation unjustifiable. The risk of killing innocents is inherent in every strategic bombing mission flown over occupied Europe. It is accepted, absorbed, noted in after-action reports, and filed away. The question of accuracy becomes an objection to bombing Auschwitz only when Auschwitz is the proposed target. Applied to every other mission in the same airspace, accuracy is a factor to be managed, not a reason to abort. Fighter escort. By the summer of 1944, the P-51 Mustang possesses the range to accompany bomber formations deep into Central Europe. The P-38 Lightning, also based at Foggia, serves as long-range escort on 15th Air Force missions throughout Upper Silesia. The Blechhammer raids are escorted. The Monowitz raid of August 20th will be escorted. The fighter groups know the route, know the airspace, know the Luftwaffe opposition in the sector, which by July 1944 is diminishing as German fighter strength is drawn west to counter the Normandy invasion and the 8th Air Force's unrelenting campaign over the Reich. Upper Silesia is not undefended. Flak is heavy over the oil targets, but it is manageable, and it is managed mission after mission through the summer and into the fall, so the operational variables resolve one by one into the same conclusion. Range, proven. Navigation, validated by repeated missions to the same area. Bomb load, sufficient to destroy structures far smaller than the crematoria, which are substantial brick and concrete buildings with underground gas chambers and above-ground incineration halls. Fighter escort, available. Accuracy, imperfect, as with every target in the theatre, but within the same parameters the Air Forces accept for industrial targets in the same region. What remains? What operational barrier exists that has not been addressed by the missions already flown? The answer is none. The barrier is not operational, it is doctrinal, it is political, it is categorical. The crematoria are not oil plants. The rail spur is not a marshalling yard serving German industry. The killing infrastructure processes human beings, not petroleum. And within the targeting taxonomy that governs the Allied air war, the taxonomy built on the premise that Germany can be defeated by destroying its capacity to produce fuel, steel, ball bearings and aircraft, human beings processed into ash represent no measurable degradation of the enemy's war-making potential. The gas chambers are invisible not because they cannot be seen. They are invisible because the system has no category in which to see them. This is the contradiction that historian Murray Green identified. The War Department's operational objections appear to have been manufactured, not in the sense of deliberate deception, though deception may be too strong a word for what may be a more banal process, but in the sense that the objections were generated from boilerplate, from doctrinal reflex, from the comfortable assumption that if a request does not fit the existing framework, then it must be impracticable, without anyone performing the elementary step of checking whether the 15th Air Force's own mission data contradicts the claim. No one, apparently, walks the memo down the hall to the Operations Division and asks, "Can we reach this target?" because the answer is already known. The answer was determined before the question was asked. The answer is no, because the answer must be no, because the policy says no. The bombers fly, the crematoria burn, 5 miles separate the one from the other, 5 miles measured on the same reconnaissance photographs, visible on the same navigation charts, traversed in the same minute of flight time. The gap is not distance, the gap is doctrine. And while that doctrine holds firm in the windowless offices of the Pentagon, while the memoranda circulate and the policy hardens and the file grows thicker with refusals, the trains are running. They have been running since May 15th. The spring was early in Hungary that year, the fields along the rail corridor already green when the first transports departed from the ghettos and collection points in the eastern provinces, Carpatho-Ruthenia, northern Transylvania, the deportation zones that Adolf Eichmann drew on his maps with the cold precision of a logistics planner, moving from the periphery inward, the provinces farthest from Budapest first, calculated to minimize panic, to prevent the capital's Jews from grasping what awaits them, until the machinery is already running at full capacity and resistance is impossible. 4 to 6 trains per day, each train carrying 3,000 to 4,000 people. The Hungarian gendarmerie handles the loading, the beatings, the compression of 80 or 100 bodies into cattle cars designed for 40, the sealing of doors, the attachment of waybills that list the cargo as resettled persons bound for labour deployment in the east. The gendarmerie is efficient. The Hungarian State Railway, SMV, is efficient. The German Reichsbahn, which takes over at the border crossings, is efficient. The system runs on schedules, on coordination between 4 separate railway administrations, on the careful allocation of rolling stock during a period when the German transport system is strained by military demands on every front. The fact that 147 trains can be assembled and routed for this purpose across nearly 2 months speaks to the priority the killing holds within the German system. Rolling stock that might carry ammunition or fuel or replacements to the Eastern Front is instead carrying Hungarian Jews to Birkenau. The route from Hungary to Auschwitz runs through Slovakia. The Košice-Prešov line, specifically, the corridor that Roswell McClellan's cables identified, the corridor that Paley's letter referenced, the corridor that sits in the War Department's files alongside the refusal. The trains cross the Slovak border, pass through Žilina, continue north into Upper Silesia, and arrive at the new rail spur that the SS construction office completed inside Birkenau in May, a spur built specifically to bring the transports directly to the gas chambers, eliminating the previous need to unload at the main Auschwitz rail station and march prisoners to the killing facilities. The new spur terminates between Crematoria 2 and the Third. The selection platform is 200 metres from the undressing rooms. The entire process, arrival, selection, undressing, gassing, cremation, can now be completed within hours. The crematoria are operating at peak capacity, 10,000 bodies a day reduced to ash. The ovens cannot keep pace. Open-air burning pits supplement them, the flames visible at night for miles. The Sonderkommando, prisoners forced to operate the cremation machinery, work in shifts around the clock. The smell carries on the wind across the countryside. Polish farmers in villages miles from the camp know what is burning. The air crews flying at 26,000 feet cannot smell it. But the smoke is there, rising into the atmosphere they traverse, mixing with the contrails of their engines. May 15th to July 9th, 56 days, 437,000 people. Place these numbers against the calendar of Washington's deliberations. Paley's initial approach to McCloy occurs in late June. By that date, approximately 300,000 Hungarian Jews have already been deported. The cables from McClelland, transmitted through the Bern embassy, describe the operation in real time, the number of transports, the route, the destination, the fate upon arrival. The War Refugee Board possesses this information. The War Department receives it. The deportations are not a retrospective discovery. They are a documented, ongoing event visible to American intelligence as it happens. And then, in early July, a pause. Miklos Horthy, the aging regent of Hungary, the man who permitted the deportations to begin, who allowed Eichmann's apparatus to operate on Hungarian soil, who signed the necessary decrees, reverses course. Under extraordinary international pressure, from Pope Pius X, from King Gustav V of Sweden, from the International Committee of the Red Cross, from the American and British governments whose diplomatic notes carry implicit threats of post-war accountability, Horthy orders the deportation stopped. The final transport departs July 9th. The Budapest Jews, approximately 200,000 people, are, for now, spared. The Horthy halt is real. It demonstrates that external pressure can influence the machinery, that the calculus of Hungarian collaboration is not fixed, that Horthy, a political survivor above all else, responds to the perception that continued complicity will bring consequences. The Vatican's intervention matters to him. Roosevelt's public warning, issued June 26, threatening retribution against those complicit in the persecution, matters to him. The combined weight of international condemnation creates, for a brief window, a political environment in which stopping the deportations costs Horthy less than continuing them. This raises the question that cannot be answered with certainty but cannot be dismissed. Would American bombs on the rail lines, on the crematoria, on the infrastructure of killing itself have hardened that halt? Would the physical demonstration of Allied willingness to act, not merely to warn, not merely to promise post-war tribunals, but to expend ordnance, to risk air crews, to declare by deed that the killing itself constitutes a target, have extended the window? Would it have made Horthy's reversal more durable, made the German pressure to resume deportations more difficult to apply, made the Aracross coup of October less certain of its murderous mandate? No one can answer these questions definitively. History does not grant controlled experiments. But the temporal collision remains. While Washington refused, the trains ran. While the memo circulated, the selections continued. While the policy held, 10,000 people a day entered the gas chambers and did not emerge. And then the memo itself arrives. August 14th, 1944, 5 weeks after the Horthy halt. 5 weeks after the last Hungarian transport, but with full knowledge that the halt is fragile, that the Budapest Jews remain in mortal danger, that the killing apparatus at Birkenau stands ready to resume operations at any moment. McCloy signs the reply. It is addressed not to Paley, but to the World Jewish Congress, which has filed its own parallel request. The language is precise, bureaucratic, final. The operation is impracticable. It would require the diversion of considerable air support essential to the success of forces now engaged in decisive operations. It would be of doubtful efficacy. 3 assertions. No evidence. No citation of a specific operational study. No reference to range tables, to sortie availability, to the targeting assessments that 15th Air Force Headquarters produces daily for every mission in its portfolio. The memo does not say, "We consulted General Twining's staff and they determined the target is beyond range." It does not say, "We examined the flak defences and concluded the losses would be prohibitive." It does not say, "We modelled the bombing pattern and found the risk to prisoners unacceptable." It says none of these things because, as far as the documentary record reveals, none of these consultations occurred. The memo speaks with the authority of a conclusion reached without investigation. It asserts impracticability in the same week that 15th Air Force bombers are being briefed for their next mission to Upper Silesia. It claims diversion in a theatre where the target lies along routes already being flown. It pronounces doubtful efficacy without defining what efficacy would mean, without engaging the argument that destroying the gas chambers, even temporarily, even imperfectly, might save some fraction of the lives still at stake. The confident tone is the most revealing element. There is no hedging in the memo, no acknowledgement of difficulty, of tragic trade-offs, of the genuine moral weight pressing down on both sides of the question. The memo reads as though the matter were simple, as though impracticability were self-evident, as though the decision required no anguish because it required no thought. This is the language of institutional closure, of a question answered before it was asked, of a policy that predates the specific request and survives any specific rebuttal because it operates at a level beneath argument, at the level of categorical assumption, where rescue is simply not a military objective, where the killing of civilians by an enemy power is simply not a targeting consideration, where the only legitimate use of a bomber is the destruction of the enemy's capacity to fight, defined in terms of fuel and steel and rubber and nothing else. 6 days later, on August 20th, the bombers fly to Monowitz. They strike the IG Farben plant. They release their ordnance from 26,000 feet. The bombs fall on the synthetic rubber works, on the cooling towers, on the rail sidings that serve the factory. Some bombs miss the plant and fall in open fields. Some fall on the labour camp adjacent to the factory, killing prisoners, the collateral damage that is accepted, absorbed, filed. The formation turns for home. The crematoria of Birkenau stand 5 miles to the west, untouched, operational, their chimneys streaming smoke into the same August sky. The file sits in the War Department archives. The memo sits in the record. Impracticable, diversion, doubtful efficacy. 3 words that close a door behind which the central evidentiary question of this story waits. Who decided, and on what basis, and whether the decision survived contact with the facts that were already known, that were visible in the reconnaissance photographs, legible in the mission logs, audible in the engines of the bombers that passed overhead while the killing continued below. The answer, or the absence of an answer, accumulates its weight through the remaining weeks of August as the summer heat settles over Upper Silesia, and the smoke continues to rise from Birkenau, and the bombers continue to fly their appointed routes to their appointed targets, 5 miles short of the structures that burn day and night without interruption, without interference, without a single bomb falling from the sky that crosses above them. The reconnaissance cameras fire automatically. They are mounted in the bellies of the bombers, triggered by the same intervalometer that releases the ordnance, and they capture everything below in overlapping frames. The impact pattern on the IG Farben plant, the smoke rising from the struck cooling towers, the rail sidings cratered and bent, and then, at the edge of the frame, the geometric regularity of a different kind of installation. Rows of barracks, a perimeter fence, rectangular structures with chimneys. The camera does not discriminate. It records what is there. The film canisters returned to Foggia with the aircraft are processed in the photographic interpretation units, and the analysts bend over their light tables with stereoscopic viewers, marking bomb damage to the industrial target, calculating percentage of destruction, noting which structures will require follow-up strikes. They are looking at the IG Farben plant. They are trained to look at the IG Farben plant. The structures at the edge of the frame, the crematoria, the gas chambers, the selection ramp, the undressing rooms, pass beneath their gaze unmarked, uncategorized, invisible within the taxonomy that governs their work. The photographs are filed. The damage assessment is forwarded to 15th Air Force Headquarters at Bari. The mission is logged as a success. On that August day, 127 B-17 Flying Fortresses, escorted by 100 P-51 Mustangs, release 1,336 bombs onto the synthetic rubber and fuel works at Monowitz. The formation approaches from the south, navigates by the Vistula, identifies the target complex by its distinctive industrial silhouette against the flat Silesian plain. The crews have flown this route or routes like it before. They know the landmarks. They know the flat concentrations over Bleckhammer, over Oświęcim, over the river crossings. They know the fuel load required, the time over target, the rally point for the return leg. This is a standard heavy bomber mission at the outer edge of comfortable combat radius, demanding certainly, but routine in the operational vocabulary of the 15th Air Force in the summer of 1944. No extraordinary measures are required, no experimental tactics, no diversion from existing operational patterns. The bombers fly to Upper Silesia because the oil plan sends them there. They strike Monowitz because the targeting committees have designated IG Farben's synthetic fuel production as a priority objective. They photograph the results because standard operating procedure requires bomb damage assessment. And in the photographs, captured on the same film, developed in the same chemicals, filed in the same archives, the gas chambers of Birkenau sit in their geometric precision, untouched, unmentioned, operationally non-existent. For 34 years, no one looks at those photographs with the question that matters. They sit in classified archives, then declassified archives, then storage facilities, indexed under their mission numbers, their target designations, their dates. They are photographs of an industrial bombing mission. That is what the filing system says they are. That is how they are retrieved, by researchers interested in the strategic bombing campaign, in oil target destruction, in the 15th Air Force's operational history. The structures at the frame's edge remain structures at the frame's edge. In 1978, two CIA photo interpretation specialists, Dino Brugioni and Robert Poirier, pull the photographs from the National Archives and apply to them the analytic tools of a different era and a different question. They are not looking for bomb damage to the IG Farben plant. They are looking for Birkenau, and there it is. Crematorium 2, Crematorium 3, the undressing rooms, the gas chambers, the chimneys, the prisoner barracks in their ordered rows, the rail spur that terminates inside the camp perimeter, the selection ramp. In some frames, Brugioni and Poirier identify what appear to be columns of people, prisoners being moved between compounds, perhaps toward the crematoria themselves. The resolution is sufficient. The detail is present. The Allied cameras documented the machinery of extermination while the extermination was underway, and no one read what the cameras recorded because no one was instructed to look. This is the hinge upon which the entire documentary record turns. Not the question of whether American bombers could reach Auschwitz. They reached it. Not the question of whether the targeting data existed. The cameras captured it. Not the question of whether the gas chambers were identifiable from altitude. Brugioni and Poirier proved they were, decades after the fact, using the same photographs that were available in August 1944. The question that remains is narrower, harder, more damning in its specificity. Why did no one at 15th Air Force Headquarters, no one in the photo interpretation units at Foggia, no one in the chain of command between the darkroom and the targeting committee, look at the edge of the frame and ask what those structures were? The answer is not incompetence. The answer is not oversight. The answer is doctrinal. Those structures did not fall within the categories that governed analysis. They were not fuel production. They were not synthetic rubber. They were not ball bearings or aircraft engines or rail marshalling yards serving military logistics. They were killing facilities. And killing facilities operated by the enemy against civilian populations did not exist within the targeting taxonomy of the United States Army Air Forces as objects of military interest. The gap between the bomb craters and the gas chambers, 5 miles of flat Silesian farmland, was not a product of operational necessity. It was a product of orders, of categories, of a decision made not on August 20th but months earlier, at a level of abstraction that rendered the specific geography irrelevant. The bombers could have turned 5 miles to the west. The navigators could have identified the target. The bombardiers could have toggled their switches over a different set of structures. The operational capacity existed. What did not exist was the order. And now the calendar turns. September arrives. The Hungarian transports have ceased. Horthy's July 9th halt holds, though the Jews of Budapest remain in mortal danger, and the broader killing apparatus at Birkenau continues to process prisoners from other sources. The War Refugee Board has not stopped pressing. John Peele continues to write. The requests continue to arrive at the War Department, and the War Department continues to say no. The September refusals carry a particular weight because they arrive after August 20th, after the mission logs are filed, after the bomb damage assessments are completed, after the reconnaissance photographs are processed and archived. The War Department cannot not know, that 15th Air Force heavy bombers have successfully struck a target less than 5 miles from Birkenau. The operational record is internal to the War Department itself. It is not a claim made by outsiders, not an assertion by the War Refugee Board, not a hypothesis offered by civilian advocates. It is the department's own mission data, generated by its own aircraft, filed in its own systems. And yet the refusal language does not change. Impracticable, diversion, doubtful efficacy, the same 3 words, the same categorical closure, as though the August 20th mission had not occurred, as though the operational proof did not exist within the same filing cabinets that house the refusal memos. What this reveals is not a failure of information flow, it is the operation of a policy that functions independently of information. The February 1944 determination that the rescue of victims of enemy oppression is not a military objective and therefore cannot command military resources, does not require operational justification. It requires only its own existence as policy. The operational language in McCloy's memos is decorative. It provides a surface rationale that satisfies bureaucratic convention. A memo must give reasons, must cite considerations, must present itself as the product of deliberation, but the actual governing principle operates beneath the language at the level of categorical exclusion. The question was never whether the mission was feasible. The question was whether the mission's purpose fell within the permitted categories, and rescue, the saving of civilian lives from enemy murder, did not. McCloy's own words, preserved in the documentary record, make the principle explicit in a way that the polite operational language of the refusal memos does not. The positive solution to this problem, he writes, is the earliest possible victory over Germany, to which end we should exert our entire means. This is not an operational assessment. This is a philosophical position. It asserts that the only legitimate response to the Holocaust is the general prosecution of the war, that specific interventions targeting the killing machinery are, by definition, diversions from the true objective. It renders the gas chambers of Birkenau invisible, not because they cannot be seen, but because they cannot be categorized as legitimate targets within a framework that recognizes only the enemy's war-making capacity as a valid object of destruction. The killing of civilians, however massive in scale, however industrial in method, however proximate to targets already being struck, remains outside the frame, literally outside the frame, visible at the edges of the reconnaissance photographs, present in the landscape that the bombers overfly, but doctrinally non-existent as objects of military action. The contradiction sits in the archive undisturbed. No internal memo surfaces that acknowledges it. No staff officer at 15th Air Force Headquarters writes to ask whether the structures 5 miles west of Monowitz might merit examination. No photo interpreter flags the geometric precision of the Birkenau compound and requests clarification of its function. The compartmentalization is complete. The oil plan generates targets. The targeting committees assign missions. The bombers fly. The cameras record. The analysts assess damage to designated objectives. And 5 miles away, the crematoria operate at a pace that will continue through the autumn, processing transports from Łódź, from Slovakia, from the remaining Jewish communities of occupied Europe, until November the 25th, when Heinrich Himmler, for reasons of his own, driven by the approaching Soviet armies and the calculus of negotiation, orders the gas chambers demolished and the evidence destroyed. Between August 20th and November 25th, 97 days. 97 days during which the crematoria continue to function, during which the War Department continues to refuse, during which the 15th Air Force continues to fly missions over Upper Silesia, returning to Monowitz, striking Blechhammer, hitting oil targets throughout the region, and during which the 5-mile gap remains unclosed. The reconnaissance photographs accumulate in the archive. The refusal memos accumulate in the War Refugee Board's files. The dead accumulate in the ash pits of Birkenau. On November 8th, Pehle makes his final attempt. He formally forwards the Werber-Wetzler report to McCloy. The full text, the 33 pages of meticulous description, that Rudolf Weber and Alfred Wetzler dictated after their escape in April. The gas chambers, the crematoria, the selection process, the daily capacity, the rail spur. Everything that the reconnaissance photographs had recorded without interpretation, the Weber-Wetzler report describes in human language, from the perspective of men who walked through the machinery and survived to testify. Paley attaches the report and urges again the destruction of the killing facilities. 10 days later, on November 18th, McCloy responds. The War Department, he writes, should not undertake these operations, at least for the present. The language has shifted slightly. The qualifier, at least for the present, introduces a temporal element absent from earlier refusals, as though the question might be revisited at some future date. But by November 18th, the question is already becoming moot. 1 week later, Himmler issues his demolition order. The gas chambers of Birkenau will be destroyed, not by American bombs but by the SS themselves, dismantling the evidence as the Red Army advances from the east. The window that was open through the summer and autumn of 1944 closes not because the Allies act but because the killing stops, or rather because the killing shifts form, death marches replacing gas chambers, exposure and shooting replacing industrial murder, as the camp system collapses under the pressure of Soviet advances. The documents survive. They sit today in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, and in the Roosevelt Presidential Library at Hyde Park. Paley's carefully typed letters, McCloy's responses on War Department letterhead, the Weber-Wetzler report with its clinical precision, the 15th Air Force mission folders with their bomb damage assessments, and their reconnaissance photographs. The physical objects carry their own testimony. The paper is aging. The typewriter ribbons left impressions that remain legible after 80 years. The file folders bear classification stamps long since declassified, routing slips showing which officers received copies, initials of the clerks who logged them in and filed them away. These are the artifacts of a decision, not an abstraction, not a historical force without human agency, a decision made by men whose names are in the record, whose offices are known, whose daily calendars can be reconstructed, who sat at specific desks in specific buildings and read specific documents and signed specific memos and sent them through specific channels to specific recipients. McCloy lived until 1989. He served as High Commissioner for Germany after the war, as President of the World Bank, as an advisor to presidents. The Auschwitz question followed him, not immediately, not in the first decades after the war, when the strategic bombing campaign was assessed primarily in terms of its contribution to German economic collapse. But as the Holocaust entered American public consciousness with greater force in the 1970s and 1980s, as the reconnaissance photographs were discovered and published, as historians reconstructed the documentary trail of requests and refusals, the question pressed upon him with increasing weight. In 1983, in an interview, he offered a statement that historians have examined with care. The matter, he suggested, was not much of an episode in his life. The phrasing is striking, not a denial of the decision, not a defense of it, a minimization, a claim that the question, which has consumed historians and ethicists for decades, occupied little space in the consciousness of the man who signed the refusal. Whether this reflects genuine memory, the sheer volume of decisions passing through an assistant secretary's office in wartime, or a later construction designed to deflect moral scrutiny, the documentary record cannot determine. What the record can determine is that the requests arrived, that they were specific, that they were accompanied by detailed intelligence, that the operational capacity existed and was demonstrated, and that the answer was no. The decision cost, measured in human lives, resists precise quantification, as all counterfactuals do. Had the rail lines been struck, would the Germans have repaired them, as they repaired damaged rail infrastructure elsewhere? Likely yes, within days or weeks. Had the gas chambers been hit, would the killing have continued by other means? By shooting? By starvation? By exposure? Possibly. Would the bombing itself have killed prisoners within the camp compound? Almost certainly. These are the considerations that the refusal memos gesture toward without engaging. The doubtful efficacy that McCloy invokes but never analyzes. And they are real considerations. The moral calculus is not simple. The operational uncertainties are genuine. What is not genuine, what the documentary record exposes with unforgiving clarity, is the claim that these considerations were weighed, that a genuine analysis occurred, that the operational questions were asked and answered. that the decision emerged from deliberation rather than from categorical exclusion. The refusal was not the product of tragic reasoning, it was the product of no reasoning at all, or rather, of a prior reasoning that had already closed the category before the specific question arrived. The smoke from Birkenau's chimneys rose through the summer and autumn of 1944 into skies that American aircraft crossed regularly, on missions briefed and approved and executed within the same command structure that received and refused the bombing requests. The reconnaissance cameras recorded what was below. The photographs were filed. The analysts looked at what they were trained to look at and did not look at what fell outside their categories. The memos were written, signed, sent, received, filed. The cables crossed between Washington and Bern, between Treasury and War, between Paley's office on New York Avenue and McCloy's office in the Pentagon. The paper trail is complete, the decision is legible, and the 5 miles between the bomb craters at Monowitz and the crematoria at Birkenau remain what they have always been. Not a distance that could not be crossed, but a distance that was not.